Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. We're in the middle of a group of special episodes here where we are highlighting some projects that come from the This Day team. As it happens, a bunch of projects that we've all been working on are all sort of coming out around this time. So we're just talking about it, spreading the word. There was definitely some history in here as well. But today we're going to look at the Obama Oral History Project. This is a big, years in the making project from Columbia University that involves a bunch of scholars. That is an attempt to capture a lot of the most important and interesting and historically resonant stories from the Obama administration. It features dozens and dozens, hundreds of interviews with people in and out of the Obama administration, and it is now rolling out. There's a beautiful website where you can go look at some of these. It's getting lots of great press coverage, and the first batch of interviews and oral history that has come out is largely about environmental issues within the Obama administration, things like the Keystone Pipeline and the BP Gulf oil spill, but there will be more rolling out over the coming months. As I said, lots of prestigious scholars and historians involved in this, including one of the leads, our very own Nicole Hemmer, who started this when she was at Columbia. She is now at Vanderbilt, but has continued to work on this project. So now we can finally talk about the Obama Oral History Project that Nikki has been working on for a long time. So here, as always, is Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt, and joining us, Kelly Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
And congrats to you, Nikki. We're in the middle of this stretch of everyone sort of talking about cool projects, but this is a very cool project.
Thank you. Yes, it's very exciting to see kind of the first little tidbits leaking out into the world, because I feel like it's a big special project and people are going to get to see through this like tiny amuse-bouche why it's so great.
Well, you know, it's funny you bring that up because I was thinking, like, I think close listeners, at least to this podcast, will recognize that, like, from time to time over the last year or so, we've known that you've been working on this project. And I feel like I've sort of hinted at it. I've been like, oh, Nick, you probably know about this because of your work with the Obama Oral History. Was I like breaking an NDA or something and referencing that?
I mean, there is quite a lot that I'm not allowed to talk about. So, you know, we've released these 17 interviews out of like 470, and we're not allowed to talk about like who the other people are that we interviewed or give you details from the interviews. The two interviews that haven't been released that I am allowed to spoil are our interviews with Michelle and Barack Obama.
Well, there you go.
I can't tell you what happened, but I can tell you we talked to them.
What did you talk about?
But, you know,
things.
No one is sitting here on pins and needles waiting about some other name. That's one thing I want to know. So you got that.
You're like, but what about the Undersecretary of Agriculture?
Exactly. Yeah, I know. Tell me you got them. But we'll get into some of the things you learned. But one more question just about the process and the sort of scope and the goal. Because this is an incredible set of interviews, and even from what we've seen now, you know, but it does feel very much kind of like what a president does when they're building their presidential library, right? Mm-hmm. How have you thought about that? Why is it happening through Columbia in this way as opposed to what a president normally does?
Yeah, so the idea of having a presidential oral history that is independent is really important, right? So that you're able to talk to the people you want to talk to, that you're able to, as historians, build an archive, right, without any interference from people who are very invested in the legacy of the administration. This was actually a project that was very different even from previous presidential oral histories. Previous presidential oral histories talk to the people at the very top of an administration. So like the president, vice president, cabinet secretaries, maybe a few other people who were significantly placed, maybe one or two members of Congress. But in this case, like I said, we interviewed almost 500 people, but it included outside activists. It included ordinary people. And so what you have in this oral history are voices of dissent. You know, people who were harmed by the administration's choices in some cases, people who pushed back against the administration, critics from the left and right and across the political spectrum. And I think you get a much fuller picture, not only of the administration and its consequences, but just what it was like to live in the United States and in the globe during the years that Obama was in power. And that feels like a pretty special archive. And it's exactly that. Like an archive has a politics based on who's included and who's not included. Mm-hmm. And I'm really vested in the values that this archive represents.
I love this so much because I've been to a ton of presidential libraries and seen a lot of presidential archives and papers and all of that stuff. And a lot of it, you can tell, oh, this is highly curated. You know, like there's no scandal in here. Like there's no mention of, you know, people who shall not be named. I mean, like it is very...
Or like Watergate.
Yes,
the Nixon one ends in like the fall of 73. That's
right. I think it was the Clinton Presidential Library. There's no mention of Monica Lewinsky. There's a small paragraph to like Kenneth Starr, and that's like it. And you're like, really? Like if you were to not know this history, you would never know that some of these things took place. So I love that dissent is there, and that you see people who are trying to speak truth to power, or to give their sort of concerns to power, and who is able to gain influence or not, or who is heard and who's not. That to me is just fascinating, because most presidents would not want that sort of on the table.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Did you, in talking to people up and down the org chart, did you get a better sense of kind of where power really lies in an organization like this?
Absolutely. And the thing that the idea behind the project, but also that the project bore out, is that power doesn't just move from the top down. And in fact, in some of these agencies, and I can say this without breaking any confidentiality, is because we know this just from reporting, but like you'll have policy set by, say, the Director of Homeland Security on Immigration. And then you'll have ICE agents who are doing something very different. You'll have a liberalization of, say, pot enforcement happening at the top of one of the cabinet agencies. And then you'll have DEA agents who are out there making arrests anyway. So that's one place that you see it. But also
sometimes your vice president will just announce a change in policy on gay marriage without consulting anyone, as we talked about a couple weeks ago. But yes.
Exactly. Well, and also like that there are activists who move the administration to do things that it wouldn't otherwise do. And that's pretty exciting to see, because it does suggest that power comes from a lot of different places, and that ordinary people have power. And have the capacity to make change. And that's also kind of exciting to remember, too, because you don't always feel like you have a lot of power in this world. And seeing sometimes positive change happen that regular people are making happen it's pretty cool.
Yeah. Or even if it's not power, to see how people can have influence, to see what it means when someone can be persuasive. And maybe they're not the persuasive argument that pushes the president over the edge, but maybe the next several, arguments will. And so it's interesting to see like how people lead the charge on things that eventually become what they want to see. It just might not have finished with them. So I think about like, I don't know, like the pipeline, and you think about like, or solar panels or things that like were environmentally progressive legislation that people wanted to push, that sometimes they found success and sometimes they didn't, or sometimes there were delays in that success. But like, again, it's really cool to see how certain things play out.
And this idea of power actually ties in really well with the 17 interviews that were just released. So they were all focused on the area of climate change, and it's people within the administration and activists and farmers and people outside. But one of the stories that I want to highlight is somebody who was working in the administration. Her name was Courtney Height. She was a young activist. She had worked on the campaign because she was really into Obama. And she had been sent out to various states during the 2008 election. And then she was brought into the administration as part of the Council on Environmental Quality. And after about a year, she was like, I think I have to leave, because I will have more power when it comes to climate change and activism if I'm pressuring the administration from the outside rather than working here on this little council inside the White House.
Wow.
And she goes off and she joins the Energy Action Coalition. She becomes the head of it.
Wow.
It's later renamed Power Shift. She gets arrested at the White House protesting.
Amazing.
Wow.
She's like waving to her former colleague.
I know.
Well, her hands were behind her back, but, sort of nodding.
Oh, man. That's intense. That's intense. And shows
but
the
somewhere
level of
in there,
commitment.
yeah, right. But somewhere in there is also probably an understanding that she knows, like, that the White House is listening to activists, right? Because if she's like, well, I'm going to go out and I'm going to be completely iced out, then maybe there's a different calculus.
Absolutely. Both the idea that there are ways to penetrate the White House, especially during the Obama administration. There was this Office of Public Engagement that was listening and that was having regular meetings with activists. But, climate change just wasn't high on the agenda. There was a major financial crisis. Yep. There was all of these different things going on. Couple of them. And so climate change just, cap and trade fails. And so there's this real need to have activists pushing. But she also understood that somebody who worked at the White House, who got arrested outside of the White House, is going to be in news stories. So it is another way that you're exercising influence and pressure.
Plus, I imagine that working inside any government bureaucracy, things just move slowly. You just can't get that kind of acceleration that you want when you're putting someone's feet to the fire. You have to go through all of the steps and process approvals, whatever. That you don't really have to do that when you're an activist. You can literally go straight to the front line and get more traction through that public pressure than if you were working on the inside.
Yeah, and that's actually the story of this other couple that we interviewed, Art and Helen Tandrup. So these were a couple who lived in Nebraska. They were planning to retire to their family farm. And then they learned that the Keystone XL pipeline was going to run through their land. And this actually also happens with a number of Indian reservations. Like, this pipeline was going to have an effect on people's lives and livelihoods. And in that moment, they hadn't planned, like Courtney Height had always been an environmental activist. They'd never planned on being environmental activists. They joined something called the Cowboy Indian Alliance, which
what is that?
Finally.
It's an alliance between
there's such a thing.
There is such a thing. And it's this alliance between mostly white Westerners, so ranchers, farmers, the idea of the cowboy, and indigenous people, indigenous activists who had been doing this environmental work for decades. And because they have a shared interest in preserving and protecting the land, but also preventing this potentially catastrophic pipeline from running through their land and through their communities, they team up together. They do protests, but they do protests through art. They do crop art installations. They're really creative ways of calling attention to these problems and to these crises. And of course, the Obama administration caves. They do move. They cancel the pipeline. And I think it's one of those stories, and we could go more in depth in it at some other time, but one of those stories where activists really were shaping policy in some pretty incredible ways.
I think that's awesome.
You're used to hearing my voice on the world, bringing you interviews from around the globe.
And you hear me reporting environment and climate news. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're now with you hosting The World Together. More global journalism with a fresh new sound.
Listen to The World on your local public radio station and wherever you find your podcasts.
It's funny. I mean, Keystone XL was a huge story at the time, but I think now, however many years later, and certainly in a few years, it actually fits nicely into a podcast that would look at overlooked stories or forgotten stories, right? I could see us doing an episode about Keystone XL in a couple of years, which shows you kind of. So to that end, what was the bar or the threshold for moments in the Obama administration that felt like they were ones that you wanted to do interviews around?
A lot of times it had to do, sometimes we start it with an event. So something like the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. You wanted to understand everything along the path from the president and his advisors and the decisions that they were making to the people who worked for Deepwater Horizon, to the people fishing in the Gulf whose livelihoods were disrupted, and how they understood the response of the administration, the responsibility of the administration, how their lives were affected by this major environmental catastrophe. And sometimes, we spent a lot of time just exploring each of these issues, and especially when it came to kind of regular people like this. We wanted them to have some sort of connection to the Obama administration. Maybe they had been invited to the White House at some point. Maybe they had written a letter to the president that he'd responded to. It didn't always have to happen because, of course, some critics were never invited in and you wanted to get their voices too. But that was one of the metrics we used to try to decide who we'd bring in.
Yeah. I noticed one of the smaller stories that's in there, but it ties into an episode that we've done, is the solar panels on the White House.
Yeah.
So Carter, right? As people who listen to our episode will remember, Carter installed them. Reagan tore them down. The original solar panels were like in a closet somewhere. But there was an effort to put them back under Obama.
There was another failed effort. But Bill McKibben, who is one of the leading environmental activists in the United States, certainly one of the most visible ones, he heads up 350.org. He, in September 2010, joined up with two young climate activists who found these solar panels, which at the time were in Maine. They drive them down from Maine to Washington, presumably in an electric car. And the idea was they wanted to present these solar panels to the White House so the White House could put them up as a sign that they were continuing on Carter's mission to make the White House more green and to push forward this environmental agenda. And the White House was like, no, thank you. We don't want those.
I wonder, though, the reasoning behind that. I mean, is it that how old are those solar panels? Like, solar panels have come a long way. Do you know what I mean? One,
yes.
Like, we could get a better model. Or two, is it, I think about, like, and this may seem superficial, but like the aesthetics of seeing solar panels on the White House. Like, are people thinking about the optics of that?
Well, and also add into it, even though many, many people now love Jimmy Carter, he wasn't held up as the most successful president of the 20th century. And so maybe like calling back to Jimmy Carter when you're in your first term of office, when the economy isn't doing great, calling attention to Jimmy Carter is maybe not the message that you want coming out of the White House. I will say that this Office of Public Engagement, the officials there met with McKibben and the activists. They had a conversation with them. And that's something. But that symbolic gesture did not see itself followed through on.
As we wrap up, I'm just curious, if you can offer a sort of larger thought about, because this first tranche is about environmental policy and activism. I think the Obama administration has received a lot of criticism for not acting as if we were in a climate emergency in the way that a lot of activists feel like we are. A lot of people feel like we are. Did you get a sense of kind of why they were acting the way they were acting and whether that criticism was merited?
I think the administration was pretty sensitive to that criticism, and that comes through a lot. I don't just mean sensitive to, meaning responsive to. I mean a little irritated by. They did push for certain environmental changes. Part of that was legislative failure and the difficulties of getting legislation through. There were big changes that happened in the Environmental Protection Agency and the kinds of regulations that the administration enforced, powers that are now being stripped by the Supreme Court. So there were things that were happening. They weren't always that visible. The administration wasn't as responsive to climate activists. Part of it was a belief from the administration, coming from Obama on down, that there's a role for activists, that activists should be pressuring the administration, but that the administration is not an activist organization, that activists have different goals and tactics, and the administration sometimes takes the slow road. I also think that just given so many pressing immediate crises, some of that like tapping into longer term crises and problems frankly fell through the cracks, fell by the wayside. And so it's a combination of factors that limited the administration's reach on this. But I think that in part because the administration didn't do as much as people wanted, I do think one of the things you see at the end of the Obama administration is a much larger, much more energized, and in some ways more radicalized climate movement, because it wasn't enough to have a Democratic president. So therefore, what else do we need to get the changes that many people believe are existential to actually be put into place?
Right.
Wow. I just had a question about, I guess, did you have an idea or maybe a preconceived notion of what you thought you might hear in these interviews, and then after 470 interviews later, how did your perceptions change of what you thought of the Obama administration? Because it was so recent, we've all lived through it. I think we all had certain like ideas about like, oh, well, this was a failure or this was a success or whatever. Did you change any of your opinions or ideas after this concluded?
So without spoiling any of the other 450 or so interviews that are going to come out, I can say I think I came out of this more critical of the administration as a whole. And yet at the same time, I mean, one of the most fascinating things about this project was going and talking to the people who were running the country for 8 years and realizing that they were people, right?
For better or worse.
For better or worse. These are jobs that any of the three of us could one day do, whether if we wanted to. And that it's just people making these decisions and they're going to make mistakes and they have competing agendas and they're being asked to do jobs that are actually too big for them and they're asked to like interact with a series of ossified institutions to try to create change. That it's very difficult work and it's easy to kind of lose sight of some of the bigger overarching goals. I've certainly gained an appreciation for how difficult change is and for how complicated power is and for the Obama administration more broadly, because, when we get more historical distance, seeing it as the space between the Bush Jr. administration and the Trump administration, I think is going to do a lot to rescue its legacy.
Absolutely. Yeah.
All right. Well, we will leave it there and maybe, we'll do future episodes tied to it as stuff comes out. But I will say the stuff that's already out now is incredible and incredibly presented, right? The website is really beautiful and easy to navigate and engaging. And so go spend some time with that in addition to reading all the other sort of commentary and reporting that's coming out of the tidbits. But Nikki, congratulations on this. I know this has been a long time in the making.
Yeah, it's so exciting for it to come out. Thanks, Jody.
And Kelly Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.